Let's take a look at a few applications dealing with motion. So motion questions are using, again, the formula that distance equals rate times time. So hopefully we remember that from before. And notice I'm utilizing that table again. I'm using that because I feel a lot of my students, it helps them to make sense of creating the equation, whereas if they didn't have a table, they would just feel a little lost in the woods, so to speak. So here, again, I'm looking at two different directions. I'm hiking downhill to Moose Lake and then back uphill to the campsite. And so I'm just going to fill in what I know as I read the question. So a hiker can hike 1 mile per hour faster downhill to Moose Lake than she can hike uphill to the campsite. So that doesn't tell me anything because I don't know how fast she's going uphill, downhill, etc. It does take her 3 hours to hike to the lake, which is downhill to the lake, 3 hours, and 4.5 to hike back, which is uphill to the campsite, 4.5 hours. What is her speed hiking back to the campsite? So speed is rate, and that is what we're trying to find. So if I want the speed back to the campsite, which is, I'm going to call that x, because it's the easiest thing to do is to create a variable for whatever you're trying to solve for. So I'm going to call that x. Well, let's go back to that thing I kind of skipped over. She's going 1 mile per hour faster downhill, and so if it's x miles per hour uphill and it's 1 mile per hour faster downhill, that's going to be x plus 1. Now, I often get the question, would it work if I made downhill to the lake x and uphill to the campsite x minus 1? And of course it would, but when you get to the end, it's much more satisfying to make x be whatever it is that we're trying to solve for, which in this case is the hiking back uphill to the campsite. Now notice, I have no idea what the distance is. It doesn't tell us, and so you might be freaking out a little bit. But what we know is obviously the distance from the campsite to the lake is the same as the distance from the lake to the campsite. So what I'm going to do is utilize this formula and say that distance equals rate times time. So the distance downhill to the lake is 3 times x plus 1, because I'm multiplying those two things. And the distance uphill to the campsite is 4.5 times x, because I multiplied those two things. And again, what do I know about the distances? That they're equal to one another. So 3 times x plus 1 should be equal to 4.5x because the distance didn't change. And now it's just a matter of doing the algebra. So 3x plus 3 equals 4.5x. Let's get all the x's to one side. I'm going to subtract 3 from each 3x from each side. Divide each side by 1.5. And I get x equals 2. So did I answer the question? The question is, what is her speed hiking back to the campsite? My answer would be she hiked 2 miles per hour to the campsite. Now, how much to the lake? Obviously 3, x plus 1, but we don't need to find that because they asked specifically what's her speed to the campsite. This one is a little bit harder than the last one that we did. It's mostly the same with just one little trick, and I'm not going to point that trick out to you yet. I would really like for you to struggle with it a little bit, give it your best shot. If you do it, you are amazing. If you don't, you're still amazing. You just need a little bit more extra help, which is just fine. So press pause, try this question, and then press play to check your work. So I have a roommate apparently, and we both leave home at 7 a.m., which by the way would never happen. I don't leave home by 7 a.m. Heading in opposite directions for work. You usually spend 30 minutes biking to work. So me, time 30 minutes. Now I have to do this in hours because notice my rate is in miles per hour. So we don't want to get into a situation where we're multiplying hours by minutes, etc. So my time is 30 minutes out of 60 minutes, which is 0.5 or 1/2. So because 0.5 is a nice decimal, I'll go ahead and use it. And your roommate needs 20 minutes to walk to work. So roommate is 20 minutes out of 60, which unfortunately is 0.3 repeating, so we're going to use 1/3. So fractions scare you. You got to get used to them because they happen in real life all the time. Now it says your roommate walks at an average speed of 7 miles per hour slower than your average speed. So if I know that I am at the end trying to find what is the average speed for each of you, it doesn't matter which one I set equal to x. So I'm just going to say my rate is x. My roommate's rate is 7 miles per hour slower than me, which would be x minus 7. So they're going to give you a way to relate the two values. This one's a little bit different than the last one. Last one we said, hey, it's the same distance each way. Before I set up the equation, let's go ahead and do this part, which we know, which is distance equals rate times time. So this would be 0.05x, and this one would be 1/3 times x minus 7. So I just multiplied just like I did on the last one. Now on the last one, I knew the distance was the same, so I said the distance of the first equals the distance of the second. This one is different. It says we work 6 miles apart. So what that tells me is that my distance plus my roommate's distance is equal to 6 miles. So this one, they're not equal to one another, but if I add the two together, the distance is 6 miles. So now what? Now I have to solve, and I've got a decimal, I've got a fraction, I just have a hot mess, but I don't like fractions. I'm going to just take everything times 3, so I'm going to use that fraction clearing technique that we talked about before. It's going to make it a lot easier. So I have 0.5 times 3, which is 1.5, keep my x. This one's kind of nice because I take 3 times 1/3, well that just cancels out and gives me 1 times x minus 7, which is of course x minus 7. And then 6 times 3 is 18. Then I'm going to combine some like terms to get 2.5x minus 7 is 18. Add 7 to each side, so 2.5x equals 25. And then of course, if I take 25 divided by 2.5, I'm going to get an answer of 10. Now on this one, my final answer is not 10 because it says what is the average speed for each of us. So I've just determined my average speed of 10. My roommate's average speed is x minus 7, which is 10 minus 7, which is 3. Again, make sure you show this step. So what is my final answer? I would write a sentence that says, my average speed is 10 miles per hour and my roommate's average speed is 3 miles per hour.